service this evening. Those of you who came out, I hope that you will enjoy our evening here together and find it interesting and valuable. To begin, we're going to have a song with, and Austin is going to take care of that, and we'll get into the rest of the program. Austin?
Oh, I love thy kingdom, Lord, the house of thine abode, the church, our blessed Redeemer, saved with his own precious blood. I love thy church, O God. Her walls before thee stand, the apple of thine eye, and graven on his hand. For her my tears shall fall, for her my prayers ascend. To her my years and tolls be given, till tolls and gifts shall end. Beyond my highest joy, I prize her heavenly ways. Communion, solemn vows, her hymns of love and praise. Jesus, thou friend divine, our Savior and our King, thy hand from every snare and foe shall great deliverance bring. Sure as thy truth shall last, to Zion shall he give. This glories earth can yield, and brightest bliss of heaven.
Thank you, Austin, for leading us in that song. Well, tonight we'd like to look at the theme of our heritage, aspects in a number of ways, our community, our building, our congregation. I'd like to begin, though, just by reference, a little very brief scripture reading to sort of set the tone and to sort of help us to ground that in God's Word. I'm going to read 7 verses, the first 7 verses of Psalm 78. You may listen or follow along as you need, please. The writer here, the psalmist, writes, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength, and his wonderful works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children who should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." So tonight, my hope is that as we think about things of old, things in the past, things of our heritage, from for many of us physically, for all of us spiritually, that we might have something to pass along, and also that we and the generations to come might set our hope in God, just like the psalmist called the Israelites to do, and not forget the works of God. I'm going to move to the side here so that I don't hopefully obstruct anybody's view, so I can also sort of see it. If it seems to be in this over here, you can't see through me well, you're welcome to move. There's place over here. So just a little outline of the program this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit. Hopefully I can keep it to a little bit. We also have Don Horning here. Don is a part of the New Holland Area Historical Society. I believe goes to Nessville Mennonite Church. And he's going to talk a little bit about some things and that relate to the community, the building here. Charles is going to talk a little bit about how Oasis came to be as a congregation, how we find ourselves in this location. After each of us, we'll have a brief time maybe for questions and answers, or at least questions. We'll try to answer them. And then maybe after Charles is done, we'll have another maybe slightly longer question and answer time if anybody has one. Both Don and I brought some things in the back that kind of relate to either New Holland, this building, or our background, our heritage, somewhat agricultural, somewhat spiritual there. So there's a number of things. You can look at them and pick things up. There are some things back there that were used when this was a building, was a silk mill, and some things like that. So, all right. So we're going to start by looking a little bit at our community. And what I decided to mean by our community, there's a lot of ways I thought we could go, but I decided that I'm going to primarily think of it as the community, the area that we're in, which is usually thought of as the three Earls, the townships called Earl, East Earl, and West Earl. It is a little broader than that. I wanted to sort of think about that as the community here and talk a little bit about how maybe some of our forebears came to live in this area. So that's kind of what we're going to do here to begin with. So we're going to start here by thinking about Europe. Our ancestors came from Europe. And so Switzerland is kind of one of the southern areas in this broader German-speaking region in Europe. And Anabaptism arose in the 1500s in some of the cantons or sections of Switzerland, particularly long time there were congregations in Bern, the canton of Bern, and Zurich, which is actually where it started, and Schaffhausen, were three that sort of had Anabaptist presence for a while. The Swiss government was the canton governments varied. Some were Catholic, some were Reformed, Protestant. Neither of them particularly liked Anabaptists around because they wouldn't be part of the state church, and they wanted to baptize people upon confession of faith and belief rather than as children. And there were various things, and the result was there was a lot of persecution in Switzerland, and in some of the cantons, the Anabaptists were just sort of ground out. Some were killed, some were exiled, some were just fled. That was not the case in Bern, but gradually that level of persecution did eventually sort of dwindle away. The last known execution of an Anabaptist for reasons of Anabaptism happened in 1614 when Hans Landis, who was one of the church leaders in Bern, was executed. But there was still a level of persecution, and there were waves of persecution from the government, not to the point of people losing their lives, but certainly to the point of losing their ability to stay in the canton. They used exile as one of their preferred methods. And so as time went by, it was difficult for Anabaptists to live there and in Switzerland. And so they began to look for places that they could find a level of toleration. Flowing from from Switzerland, kind of roughly north and a little bit west, is the Rhine River. The the Rhine River served as sort of a natural avenue for people to move. And so heading north from downriver from Switzerland is an area that is called, usually in English, the Palatinate. And the people who were ruling there in the 1640s and 50s were German Reformed rulers. Not quite as hostile, maybe, as some. But the real thing was that the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, absolutely ravaged this part, because this is a part of Europe that doesn't have a lot of natural defenses. And so wars and armies swept across this region back and forth for a long, long time, 30 Years' War, entire generation. And to the extent that parts of the Palatinate were depopulated and villages were gone and fields were growing up into woods again. And so when this whole conflict finally was over in 1648, the rulers were sort of trying to pick up the pieces and say, how can we make our area prosperous? One of the things that they decided to do was to tolerate Anabaptists. And so people from Switzerland, people who some of us are direct descendants of, moved from Switzerland north to the Palatinate. And they were given areas to farm. They said, basically, if you can clear this land, you may live on it and use it. They didn't technically usually own it. It was sort of long-term leased from the ruler. Well, that worked for quite a while for Anabaptists. They were allowed to kind of be tolerated. They had to pay special taxes. They had to agree that they would only hold services on their farmsteads. They would not build churches. They were not permitted to evangelize or anything like that. They had to keep their heads down, but they were allowed to live and farm in a measure of peace that they had not experienced in Switzerland. And so for a number of years, people began moving north. And as people got exiled from Bern, that's often where they went. By the early 1700s, they realized, though, that warfare was not completely done. All right, so the big war ended in 1648, and they began to move in. Well, there were additional wars, because you got, on one side, you got the country of France. The other side is the German area. The French king, interested in expanding his territory, triggered a number of wars there in the late 16 and early 1700s. And so there's a lot of warfare. Also, as time went by, the population began to grow, but the government in the Palatinate would not give any more land for the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, by this time in that area, many of them were not using the name Anabaptist. That was a kind of a Swiss name for themselves. They increasingly began identifying themselves as Mennonites or Mennonists. Some of them also used the term Amish. And so they began to, again, look for another place to go. Their freedom to live there was always in jeopardy as long as it was a ruler's decree that allowed them to be there. It would also mean a ruler could turn on them and they would have to go. And so gradually, some of them began looking at other options, and some went east and some went west. They went down the Rhine River to Rotterdam, a port city in the Netherlands. There were Dutch Mennonites and other Anabaptists too that didn't follow Menno exactly, didn't use his name there. And kind of using some of the aid from the Dutch in the province of Holland there, they were able to take ship to go to America, particularly to Pennsylvania. William Penn started Pennsylvania in 1681. He got a grant from the king then, King Charles of England and Scotland. Then he came over here and also made an arrangement with the Native American leaders, an area that he could settle. And he started this city, the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, with the goal of having this kind of community that is characterized by true Christian faith. In his eyes, that was the Quaker faith, because he had become a Quaker. And so he allowed anybody in, pretty much anybody could come. And there were German-speaking Quakers that came, and a couple years after Philadelphia was established, they came in 1865, Germantown. Some of the people that came there were Mennonites eventually from northern Germany. They were not our direct ancestors really, but that was kind of on the outskirts of Philadelphia, a bit inland from there. And then from there, they kind of gradually settled in an area that called Franconia or Skippack. More coming by And this Atlantic voyage is something to think about. The ships that they sailed on were wooden and sails. Think about that. These were inland people whose experience with boats was probably mostly seeing boats going up and down the Rhine River, nothing like the ocean. The evidence that we have suggests that crossing the Atlantic for most people was a life-changing experience. Literally would be as life-changing as if you were one of those extremely wealthy individuals who could pay SpaceX to take you into space and back. If you had the chance to do that, I have a feeling it would, in a sense, be a life-changing experience. And you say, I have a perspective on life that I never had before. All right? Well, for these people, that's about how it was. Maybe it was even more significant. It was also a very, very dangerous thing to do. If you were a healthy young man, okay. Normal vicissitudes of sail, ship might go down, you've no control over that, but you're probably a healthy young person, you'll make it. But the Anabaptists, the Mennonites and Amish that were not moving as young single men looking to make their fortunes. They were usually moving as family units, and that meant they were bringing in their elderly, they were bringing their children, and they're packed together on these very small wooden vessels, and nobody knows anything about germ theory, but everybody does know that the chances are that not everybody who gets on the ship in Rotterdam will make it to get off in Philadelphia. And some of the voyages, the number of casualties, especially children, was very high. It was very high. Well, as they made it over to Philadelphia, and they get off, and they find some place to live. This area was the frontier in this early 1700s. This was the frontier. It was an area to which the American Indians who lived here had agreed that Europeans could settle. So there wasn't that sort of tension, although there were still some friction points between the Native Americans who lived in their villages and the settlers in very different lifestyles. But so gradually people are sort of moving in, and so it's an area that needs to be cleared to live as farmers. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Lancaster County itself. Lancaster County became a county in 1729, which was after some of these people came. At first, it was just seen as the western part of Chester County. And then they sort of said by 1729, well, there's enough people, let's call this Lancaster County. All right. Gradually, they hived off even more western portions. So eventually you have a York County west of the Susquehanna, and a Dauphin County, and a Lebanon County. But the initial counties were Chester and Berks, and then Lancaster came after that. In 1708, we have the first group of Mennonites settling in Lancaster County, in that area there. It was a group that was led primarily by a man named Martin Kindig, and also some of the Hers. Hans Her was sort of the old patriarch. Christian Her, his son, was probably a little more active as a younger man. And they called this area Pequea, after an Indian name for that creek. And they sort of established a land grant there from the Penns. They bought their land, and from William Penn would have still been alive in 1708, but he was living in England at the time. So they worked with his agent, a man named James Logan, and they set up farms, and they began that. About 10 or 11 years later, there's another sort of large group that come in 1717, and then another group in 1727, and kind of gradually there's more people coming. And some of the people, too, who moved to that area eventually started moving elsewhere, one of whom was a man named Hans Groff. Hans Groff apparently showed up in Germantown around 1696, and Hans Groff eventually moved to the Pequea community. And the story is that in 1716, some of his horses strayed away, and in an effort to track them down and find them, he crossed over the mountains and kind of found this valley with a creek, and it looked very, very appealing. And the following year, he took out a patent for 1,000 acres or more, and he built a farmstead there, and then gradually gave portions of that to his children. And And then about a year after Hans Groff moved there, Christian Wanger came and sort of did the same thing. And we find this community growing here called Groffdale, all right, which is sort of in this area. I guess, what would we say? It's where Rodney lives, or very near where Rodney lives, Rodney and Crystal, okay? So that's sort of the beginnings, and it isn't that there had never been white people around here before. There were Welsh people living. The Welsh mountain is named for a reason, okay? They were mining, but they were mostly living a little further east. There were also fur traders moving through the area. Pierre Benzalion is probably where Peters Road gets its name. He had a well sort of established thing. And anyway, all that to say, we find this area, and they call it Groffdale, which in German, Groffedal means Groff Valley. Groff is actually an interesting name. In German, it's sort of a name that can also be a title, and the English equivalent is Earl. So when they started laying out townships, they said, well, Hans Groff, his name in English would be John Earl. We'll call it Earl Township. At least that seems to be why it got the name. A couple years later, about by 1723, we have Heinrich, Jakob, and George Weber, or Weber, three brothers moving a little further east. That becomes known as Weberdal, or Weaverland, as their names get anglicized. And that's sort of my ancestral valley, I guess. A few years after that, we find Christian, Jacob, and David Martin living there. We have people moving in as well, named last names like Shirk and Snyder or Snyder, Hoover or Huber, Zimmerman, any number. We also have people named things like Good and Bauman or Bowman, Gaiman, and some of those settled a little further north, went over another little range in this area, and eventually that becomes known as Bowmansville or Allegheny. Allegheny, and some of the people that attend here would live in that area as well. I've been talking about people who mostly identified as Mennonites. There are Amish people as well that start to arrive in America in the 1730s, and they keep that identity, all right? It does seem that some of the ones who came here were probably from Amish roots in Europe, but they didn't really carry that with them. It does seem like we have Amish people living in Laycock and Manheim townships in the 1740s, and a handful in Earl Township in the 1750s, with last names like Showalter, Rupp, and Schmucker, and Byler. But there were no substantial communities of Amish here in the 1700s in this immediate area. Further south, in Laycock Township, you would have found some, and also in Berks County. And around 1760, a fairly sizable community emerges in the Morgantown area in Carnarvon Township to the east of here a little bit, where you would find people, Masts and Kurtzes and others. It was not all Mennonites and Amish, though. So in between Groffdale and Weaverland, there's an area that's sort of eventually settled as well. In 1728, we have John Diffenderfer settling here. And John Diffenderfer was not a Mennonite. He was a Lutheran. A Lutheran church in what's now in town. Is it Trinity Lutheran? Is that the name? Trinity, yeah. Started by 1730. We have German Reformed congregations emerging about 15 years later. So it was an area with a lot of Germans, and many of them came from similar background in Europe, but they weren't all the same by their faith. All right, I'm going to talk a little faster about some other things that hopefully interest you, but won't bore you too badly. I found this graphic. It's an old picture, an old painting actually, based on the attire of the people, I think probably a Quaker farm, but it's to represent a farm from the colonial and early Republic eras. The Anabaptists who were here, Mennonites and Amish, as well as a lot of the other Germans, were very innovative farmers. And particularly the Anabaptists from the Palatinate were very used to clearing land, and so they looked for places to do that. Okay? They say that in the colonial era and even after, some of the immigrants would look for the easiest places to clear, and they would just sort of clear the brush off and try to farm, not much different than the American Indians had, but that the Mennonites and Amish would look for places with big trees, because that indicated fertile, very fertile soil. If they clear the trees out was difficult. Again, a lot of the others didn't bother clearing the trees much. They girdle them and let them die. The Mennonites and Amish tended to try to uproot them and use them for fencing and things until that make larger fields. They also were pioneers in crop rotation. They used natural fertilizers, the most obvious of which is manure from livestock. So it's an interesting little tidbit, but in Europe, Mennonites were not, in the Palatinate area at least, were not allowed to own the land. They couldn't buy land. It was against the law because they weren't full citizens. They didn't belong to the right church. So a lot of them invested in livestock instead, and they became very well known for, breeding programs and all kinds of stuff there in the 17 and 1800s in Europe. And they brought some of that to America as well. Lots of livestock, and that kind of leads to a diversified sort of thing. They planted orchards as much as they could, and it went well. They traded with Philadelphia. Fur trading was a thing. Hans Groff was a trader. He did fur trading. He was involved in laying out some of the roads around here, including what we call Route 340 and Route 23. And he would have wagons going down, like the Conestoga wagon. That's a Lancaster County invention. It was the 18-wheeler of the day. They'd carry stuff distances for a long time in those wagons, and they would grow food, grain, various foodstuffs and furs, and also there was a lot of mills. They would build mills to grind the grain. Hans Groff built a mill himself. And at the end of the sort of colonial era, early republic, found this fascinating little sort of snippet. I just thought I'd have to put it up there. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a very well-known physician and leader in Philadelphia, a good acquaintance of Benjamin Franklin and kind of a very well-known person in Pennsylvania life at that point, in sort of a tour of the more outlying areas of Pennsylvania in 1789, writes this: "A German farm may be distinguished from the farms of all other citizens of the state by the superior size of their barns, the plain but compact form of their houses, the height of their enclosures," that means fences, "the extent of their orchards, the fertility of their fields, the luxuriance of their meadows," they irrigated their meadows to raise hay for their livestock, "and a general appearance of plenty and neatness in everything that belonged to them." And this is coming at a time when the whole country was sort of in this sort of post-war depression economically. It's sort of interesting to see how they sort of seem to be faring in that time. And that puts Mennonites and Amish in this area on sort of this path of agriculture and prosperity for generation after generation. I want to show you, as time went by, they acquired a fair amount of wealth. This is Christian Herr's house. It's the oldest existing building in the county now, and it was used as a residence for Christian Herr and some of his family. It also was used they would meet there for worship as well. I'm sure many of you have been to it. It's a very, very substantial building, is my point. It's made out of stone. And mill, there's a mill. Not quite sure where I got that picture from, the internet somewhere. It's a local mill, but I think it's over in the Pequea area. One of the Herrs maybe as well. Thinking just a little bit about the spiritual life of our ancestors here as well. They met in homes at first. Building meeting houses started beginning in 1750s in here. Groffdale apparently built a meeting house 1755. We have solid record that Weaverland Meeting House was built by 1766, but there seems to be evidence there was one there before that one. It may have doubled as a school. I guess there's a little bit of question on that, but it seems to go back to about that period of time as well. And so the Anabaptists that moved here, whether they were Mennonite or Amish, their spiritual lives were characterized by an Anabaptist stress on, obviously, believers' baptism, making a personal commitment or choice as an adult to become a follower of Jesus. A stress on peace, non-resistance, or they called it defenselessness in German, Verlosigkeit. A stress on holiness and discipleship and living in a community of believers. Kind of going along with that, we would have also had an influence of pietism that was spread among all the Germans, really, and that would have tended to put a lot of stress on humility, avoiding things that are seen as giving pride, but humility and simplicity in life. And those values kind of were shared by many of the Pennsylvania Germans, but they were very much a part of the sort of religious landscape for the Mennonites and Amish. And they called leaders from their own midst as needed. They had people to serve as preachers and deacons, and they didn't really use the term bishop at that point. That came a little later. To them, bishop had sort of Catholic connotations that they didn't like. They usually called their highest leader an elder or a full elder. But gradually that kind of changed and they used the term bishop. By doing that, they had a more solid congregational life than a lot of the state churches that were trying to sort of start what were really almost like missions here, Lutheran or German Reformed, where they had to have college-educated clergy members who came over from Europe, and many times they didn't have a leader like that for sometimes periods of time because they couldn't find a candidate. Whereas the Anabaptists were, they would call leadership from among their own congregations. Well, it's hustling to go over a long period of time, and I have to keep talking quickly here, but so I want to give others a chance. So that kind of carries you through into the past the Civil War era. Okay, there were ups and downs economically. There were ups and downs every time there's a war. It tests the Anabaptist belief in non-resistance. Okay, so that was true in the American Revolution. That was true in the Civil War. All right. As time goes by, there is a sense of how far do we assimilate into this America? All right. One of the signs of that was do we stop using German and start using English in our homes, in our churches, in our lives? And by the 1900, a lot of Mennonites and Amish people were really sort of feeling that sort of, how do we go? Mennonites especially. Saying younger people are learning, they do English at school. Yeah, they know Pennsylvania Dutch, but they can't read German. Maybe we should start offering English services. And there were other things too. The Sunday school movement was really big, and organized mission work, revival meetings, protracted on from night to night, higher education. All of those things are starting to affect the Mennonites and Amish in this area. And so we do find eventually, around 1877, in the Conestoga congregation emerges in Morgantown or near Morgantown, and the Millwood congregation a little further south. They're Amish Mennonites. They built meeting houses. They started Sunday schools and gradually started switching to English. And they did practice shunning. And most of the Amish that lived more in this area, which was not necessarily that numerous of a group yet, but were more the old order school to say, well, we don't want to see these changes. These folks here, sitting here with their families, are two sort of well-known leaders among Mennonites at the turn of the century, and a little bit past of that is to say the 18 to 1900s. So on the right, we have A.D. Wenger, Amos Daniel Wenger, roots in this area, born and grew up in the Midwest. He moved back here. He got married to a Lancaster County lady, and he was a revivalist. He was very well received. He preached a message of repentance and conversion in a very sort of emotional way that was very new, and a lot of Mennonite young people responded to that. He wasn't the only one, but he stayed around because of his wife's connections. Eventually, he wound up going to getting an education. He served at Eastern Mennonite School in Harrisonburg, Virginia for a while, as there getting that started too. The other man is even more maybe local than that. It's Samuel Musselman, Sammy Musselman, I think they called him. Pictures I've seen would indicate he was a very, very short guy, but apparently had a lot of drive. His legacy in some way lives on in this area. He's the guy that started Musselman Lumber, along with a brother. Sammy and his wife and his children there, they were members at Weaverland, and he was involved in, he was very much involved in trying to get a Sunday school started there at Weaverland. Sunday schools in those days weren't part of a service. It was an afternoon thing to do, and mission work. He was influential in sort of one of the first outreaches of sorts that local Mennonites did, which is the Welsh Mountain, this sort of area that was they had people living there who didn't really have a lot, and some of them were black people, some of them were white people. They got a bad reputation for being chicken thieves and beggars and just. But the point was, the Mennonites said, and actually a black pastor had come to some of the Mennonites and said, "Could you help with this?" And so for a while, he was kind of like the spiritual leader, and Mennonites were more the other. They called this the Welsh Mountain Industrial Mission. They said, we'll try to start an outreach there. We'll start a Sunday school. We'll have church. We'll have something for them to do. They tried different things. They raised corn to make brooms, and they tried to make shirts and different things like that. None of them really worked that well, but even today, there's still a Welsh Mountain Home. That's kind of the descendant of that first Mennonite outreach there, the Welsh Mountain Home. Some of you would have gone to church there at Welsh Mountain Mennonite Church, or Mountain Spring Mennonite Church, rather. Some people accepted these changes, and they call this period the quickening. Others did not. Others thought that this was the wrong approach to take, and in this area, things sort of came to a head in 1893 when the bishop of this whole sprawling Grofdale, Weaverland, Bowmansville, and by that time, lots of other churches too, Metzler's and Martindale and Lichty's and Churchtown and I don't know, Gaiman's and various churches that had been started by the Mennonites congregations, this whole sprawling, huge bishop district. The Bishop Jonas Martin from Weaverland was not comfortable with some of the changes that were coming in 1893. There's sort of a parting of ways. The conference leadership sort of kicked him out, is how I really think it happened. And so a sizable group of people associated with him, and they took the name Old Order Mennonites, and they called their conference the Weaverland Conference. And about 30 years or so later, a little longer, area had a division about the automobile, which gave rise to a horse and buggy driving wing called the Grofdale Conference, and a black cars driving wing that was also open to electricity and telephones and things like that initially. They all used German in their services, though. They didn't have Sunday schools or any organized things, and so we have a sort of an old order wing. And in all but one case, though, the meeting houses stayed with the Lancaster Conference, and so the old orders had to build new ones. So just across the road from Weaverland, there's the Weaverland Old Order Church. It looks older now because it hasn't been, modified over the years like the Weaverland congregation has, the Lancaster Conference one, but it is actually a younger church, built around 1901. They built additional churches in Grofdale and Bowmansville and many of those other places. Many of those meeting houses are used, some of those are used jointly by the Weaverland and Grofdale conferences today on alternating Sundays. Martindale was the one place where the Lancaster Conference allowed them to use the meeting house for a period of time, partly because I think they were planning to build a new one anyway, which they did eventually. So the Martindale Mennonite Church, the Old Order Church, is shared with the horse and buggy and the black car driving Mennonites, but the Lancaster Conference Church is a different building. I have to keep moving here. All right. As time went by, some Mennonites began to do things that weren't farming. In 1895, Abram Zimmerman started the New Holland Machine Company on Franklin Street here in New Holland. And that building is still there. It's apartments now. We do Christmas caroling there. And that grew around, I think, about 1940. They acquired kind of an agreement with Ed Nolt, another Mennonite man, Old Order Mennonite man, who had developed this baler in his relatively small shop, and they they acquired that, and they sort of worked together, and it became a very large agricultural implements company. So that's one of the huge parts of New Holland. All right, it's called New Holland. Its origins there, New Holland Machine Company, which is started by Mennonites. I already mentioned Musselman Lumber is a Mennonite company in the area. Another key thing in this community, a man named Victor Weaver from the Weaver Land Congregation. His wife, I believe her name was Irene. Your children there. 1937, they started a small sort of business at processing and selling chicken. That grew to be incorporated in 1946 as Victor F. Weaver Incorporated. And eventually they developed into this huge sprawling company on the western side of New Holland. And it went to second generation eventually. Victor there is an older man, and his son Dale who did it. And this Weaver chicken, it's still around as a brand name. Eventually it was sold, and it's now Tyson, right? But it was a huge, another huge component in this community. Drew in a lot of workers and things, and Mennonites in various ways, and Amish in many ways. It keeps going. I don't want to belabor the point, but 1970, Marvin and Miriam Weaver start this little supermarket that's a little bigger than a roadside stand that they'd kind of inherited, and then the smorgasbord, and we just keep on going, right? It's just there's Mennonites in business all over the place. So I won't talk about J.B. Zimmerman. I won't talk about Good Store. I'll talk about New Holland. Mennonites did not particularly live in town for quite a while, but gradually more did. And in around 1910, there was interest in starting services in the town. And that was partly because the man who was the bishop of the whole sprawling district of Groffdale, Weaverland, Bowmansville, Noah Mack was his name, moved into town after he'd kind of worked from the Welsh Mountain for a while. And there was interest in starting services. And so what they did, they decided that periodically, I don't think they did it even every Sunday at first, but they had evening services in the Methodist church up in town because the church was unused in the evening. So they had evening services starting around 1910, periodically. And that grew then to interest in a Sunday school. Sunday schools were separate from other church services in those days. They typically happened in afternoons at that era. And so in 1915, they asked, could we have Sunday school in your building in the afternoons? And the Methodists said, sure. So they started doing that as well. And there were more people living in the town, in the area that started coming. In 1922, they built a structure on Roberts Avenue, and that was chartered as New Holland Mennonite Church. And they called their first leader, a pastor named Noah Souter, called to the ministry there the following year. That building was used for quite a few years, about 20 years after it was started, 20, 30 some years, as Weaver Chicken was getting really big. One of the things he did is he needed more workers, is he began to put out sort of feelers to Puerto Rican folks who were coming into this area for agricultural work, picking, crop picking and things. And some of them say, well, I could give you year-round work if you want to move here. And so some of them did. And Victor Weaver also felt that he would like to provide them with some sort of spiritual home as well as a physical home. And so he kind of linked up with some Mennonite former missionaries to Latin American countries. T.K. Hershey, who'd been in Argentina, and there was, I think, a William Lawver, who was in Dominican Republic, and so places like that. And he said, well, could you start some services here? And they did eventually. Around 1953, I think, they started this sort of outreach here in New Holland, and it led to what was usually called the New Holland Spanish Mennonite Congregation. And they met in the basement of Kaufman's Hardware building up in town, in the middle there. In 1974, the New Holland congregation at that point was pretty large, and so they went to the western side of town, Western Ave, and they built this fairly substantial structure, which is still there today. And then the building they vacated on Roberts Avenue which is still there too. The Spanish congregation bought it. All right, so we have New Holland Mennonite, we have New Holland Spanish Mennonite, which I think today their sign is in Spanish, right? So it would be what? Iglesia Menonita de New Holland. Then I think it says, Jesucristo es el Señor. Jesus Christ is the Lord. I think that's what their church is called. So that's Mennonites in town here. Over the last, since the 90s, the New Holland Mennonite Church congregation has been steadily decreasing. I think they're probably, Sunday morning attendance is probably a smaller group than what we have here tonight. Some relatives that go there. I'm not sure how big the Spanish congregation is today, like on a Sunday, how many people it would have, but I think it's a little larger than the other one. And then, well, then there's us. So I'm going to let Don talk now. And I apologize for taking a long time. I hope it wasn't too boring. But Don's got a lot of good stuff too. He's going to share some things about New Holland and the building that we're in. All right, and every time you want to move, you just tap next. All right, Don?
So if you drove here in a car this evening, you can thank my great-grandfather, Moses G. Horning. So if you've ever heard that name, that's my great-grandfather. And so he had a dilemma that's not unlike some of the dilemmas in church today. And it was, he said, if I say the car, it should be a car, half of the people will be upset. And if I say there shouldn't be a car, the other half will be upset. What am I to do? And so that's some of the things that churches face today. Yes, and the Spanish church that met in the basement of what is now Lickety Split and also is accessible from our museum. I can take you down there, our docents can take you down there and show you that. The Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, before it was renamed Mennonite Life, had 2 years that they took tours around all the prominent Spanish historical sites as the Hispanic presence grew in Lancaster County. They came to our museum first because Victor Weaver was the first person to start that, and we had a lot of things about Victor Weaver. And so Wilbur Horning, a friend of mine, I don't think he's here, we thought he might be here, he was downstairs and he said that people would, two things happened when they walked into the Spanish people come off the bus and went down to see where they worshiped as a kid. And there's two things happened. Some of them came to happy tears as they were walking there, remembering their heritage. And then the story started coming, and the story was one of the first Spanish-speaking pastors after Lawver and the other gentleman you named. He was rather a disciplinarian, and if the children, like we have here, were acting up, he would make them come up and sit next to him for the whole time of the service. And people just hated it so badly that it was a control mechanism. So those are just two stories. In 1896, there was not enough of work for people. The farming community that Dan talked about was not absorbing all the workers. So a bunch of about four men got together at the upper end of Brimmer on the left side. It's Crossnets Ministries has apartments there. That was a funeral director's home by the name of Henninger. They got together and said, what can we do to provide occupation for people in this town? And that was the beginning of the Storb-Snader silk mill, which would be on the very other side of the red buildings over here. The red buildings on that side are all part of this complex, and you can maybe see some pictures. We'll see. No, let's go here. You say next. Okay, this is not the original one. I think the original one was to the left, but that's where it started in 1890. Let me get my dates straight here. In 1896. They started with just a small group of people in a building that was there, and I don't know what they made. It's just called a knitting mill, so I don't know that our history shows exactly what they made at that time. It was not eminently successful. They started with 58 looms doing something cloth-wise. In 1900, it was already in receivership, so it had died. By 1907, it was restarted, and that would all be over in that side, and it might have been coming a little bit towards this side. I don't have the touch that you had, Dan. There it is. That's getting closer to what you see if you look across the street, although the building has changed somewhat. Okay, now we move ahead. During the Depression, this business had gone up and down, and during the Depression, this whole complex was purchased by Frank Ix and Son for $60,000. They had plants, silk plants and weaving plants in North Carolina and I think also in New Jersey. Frank Ix Sr., which this building's named after, the Ix Silk Mill, was born in Kerfield, Germany in 1897. He married a woman by the name of Catherine Lebert de Bar, mixed German and French heritage. Obviously, by her name, you can almost tell she was French and German aristocracy. Both of them had textile experience. The Ix family had 5 or 6 hand looms in their home, and Catherine's family was in the business big time. So the people brought the Ix people. The Ix company was started with people in Germany who had knitting experience. So here we go back to Germany again, Dan. They had 5 sons: William, Edward, Charles, Alex, and Frank. And we'll talk about them later in a way that you're going to be surprised. They had a family creed. When have you heard of 6 family members in business that works? I'm going to read something. It's always dangerous for a speaker to read because you go to sleep, but we'll see if I can keep you awake here. In the office of Edward P. Ix, president of Frank Ix and Sons, there hangs a framed glass of scrap newspaper torn from a New York daily in 1934. The scrap of paper is an advertisement for The House of Rothschild, a successful movie in its day starring famous George Arliss. I don't know who he was. In the advertisement, Arliss, as the founder of an immensely successful international banking house, is shown on his deathbed. To his 5 sons assembled about him, he utters his final words: "Always stand together, never let one brother succeed while the other fails." When Frank Ix, a man who also had 5 sons in business with him, read this advertisement, it struck him forcibly as an expression of his own feelings. He tore it out from the page and wrote across it, "To my 5 sons." His mother, or his wife, Catherine, says this of the family: They did have their difficulties from time to time, as any lively household with 5 boys could be expected to have. Catherine and Frank Ix did not try to force their high-spirited boys into rigid molds of perfect behavior, but Catherine and Frank Ix did have a policy of vigorously discouraging brother antagonism from persisting beyond any one day. Mother used to say, Ed Ix now recalls, "I don't care how you boys quarrel and disagree during the day, but I don't want you to carry any of these disagreements over to the next day." She insisted that we patch up our quarrels before going to bed and made sure that we awoke the next day with yesterday's hard feelings gone. I cannot help being in a church on a Sunday night referring to these scriptures, that there should be no schism in the body. Always happens. There should be no schism in the body, but that members should have the same care one for another. Think about what they were saying about the brothers. Or Jesus' thoughts. Now it's switched again. I think it's a bad spirit in here that's doing this to me. There should be no. Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. I don't know what the Ix family, what their spiritual status were, or whether they were involved at all, but I could not help drawing the spiritual message from that. 5 brothers that ran this business where you are got along because they would not get up the next morning with yesterday's things left over. So there is something you didn't expect to get, which is a spiritual message when we're talking about your building. We'll show you a little bit about how the building looked. I don't know what there is about my touch. There is how this building looked. Now, it could be some of the things that are torn down. It was a veritable beehive of activity. There's looms of, or there is cloth going. We don't know what they did for sure. Well, we do know some things, but how I don't know a thing about weaving. I just want to tell you this place was hot and it was noisy and it was productive. They were making stuff in this building, and by the way, most of the buildings have been torn down. So it was happening here. This was. All right, that's going to a different slide. But so this is who they were, and what they were doing here, and of course what happens is that you get your business wherever you can get it. So during the war, this building was a prized building of the war effort, World War II, because they were making silk and rayon for parachutes. It was at the time the parachutes were going from silk to rayon. The reason they used silk is they packed better, with not as many creases, and of course when they were deployed they would fluff open. I was not able to find out for sure whether or not they had connectivity to DuPont being so close, because that was a fiber company. So and it's something that I felt that I have to talk to you about. This building was very important to this town because it gave a tremendous feeling of assistance to the war effort and to patriotism during a time that was very trying. The Ix company, the employees got together and bought a Jeep. The people came up from Washington to get this Jeep given to them and had a big ceremony. The Ix company got an E award, which I haven't studied, but it's some sort of award. They went somewhere to pick it up as a very important part of the effort, for the war effort. And so I can't help drawing the parallel that this building that was so important to the war effort is now occupied in part by somebody who has a peace position that they advocate. So if you talk about the cycles of life, how the cycles of life go around, so this would have been war material, and now I'm assuming that you would have sermons from time to time and studies that would say there has to be a better way to solve our world's problems. So I point that out because it was just too important for me to not tell you. As a historical society, we have to honor the people in town who their patriotism takes them to the military. And so this building would have been a building they were proud of. But now, again, I say it's used for a different reason. As things go along, the cycles of life is one of the things that happens. And so what happened was, in time, the knitting business started to fail because Colombia was where everything was happening, in the knitting, the country of Colombia. In fact, Colombians came here for a while to help them and to learn things. And so I finish by saying this particular part of it, that, well, let me point out. I said before I want to talk about the names. This is just outside of town going down Bremer Avenue. And so what you have there is Orlon Street. I think Orlon is the first, and next to the field, and Weecalf is the next. This is a housing development that was built by Ix, at least financed by them, to probably sell to their employees to try and get more people to come and work here, because this place was a beehive. There was just tons of people working here. And where the name Weecalf comes from, all right, let's see if I can do it. W, William, E, Edward, C, Charles, A, Alex, and F, Frank. So there's the 5 brothers. And so I don't know, raise your hands, how many people knew that about? Okay, that's what I thought, 0. And of course, Orlon's self-explanatory, because it was the cloth or the new fabric. But as I say, I looked up the whole idea that the adage of the only thing that's constant is change. It was attributed to Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher born in 540 BC and in Ephesus, Turkey. So we know about Ephesus, Ephesians. And so that guy coined that phrase that the only thing that's constant is change. If you remember, I started by saying that it went into receivership way back right after it started. Well, again, at the end of the use of this building, it went into various kinds of receivership, and it was completely, the building that was so active and so industrious fell to disuse. And so you are now in the building that has been reclaimed for other uses, because the silk business that we knew before is gone. And there is how it looks today. But I want to leave you with one last word, and that is that my wife and I were in Florida, and I got a call from a friend. He found we were there on Facebook or something. He found that we were there, and he got a hold of us and said, I want you to join my wife and I for dinner. I hadn't seen him for a while, and so one of the things he wanted to tell me is that he and his partner were looking into buying this property because they were real estate flippers. And during the course of the conversation, I said, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, we do have a price for a company from Reading to come and demolish the whole building. So that's how close I think the building that you're in today was not going to be here anymore. So be thankful for the building you have, the heritage has given many people jobs. It worked for the war effort. It's now a church that talks about peace, and the life cycle goes on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don. That's very fascinating. I don't know if you know, Marvin Reed actually worked in this building. I think that was mentioned before here. He used to attend our church and passed away maybe two years ago or so. If you're like me, the older I get, the more I like history. And the younger you are, the more boring this may be. So if you're nodding off and you're wondering when this is going to be over, my kids were asking me, Dad, how long are you going to talk? So I said 5 to 10 minutes. So Dan asked me to share a little bit about how Oasis got started. And so I'll walk you through some of that history. So in the summer of 2014, Mountain Spring, which Dan, you mentioned on the Welsh Mountain Home, was a small congregation meeting at the chapel there at Welsh Mountain Home, which had started from the Lichty's congregation. And incidentally, Cindy and I started attending there the second Sunday that service, or that congregation started. If you were ever in that building, it's very small. It's maybe a third or even less than the size of this space here. And you would always think you could fit one more person in, right? There's always room for one more. But there was a Sunday morning, I think in the summer of 2014, where actually a member, family, they were members, came and they literally had to go home because there was no space to sit. I want to verify that. It was, incidentally, I think John and Marion Byler that, and I was going to verify that, but I don't see them here tonight. So if that's not true, I apologize. But I think that's the way the story goes. You know, and I look back at those times with fondness. It was a growing but a very close-knit congregation. I would say for the most part, relationships were good, and church life was healthy. And so the limited space is really what started the conversation of another church. And so over the summer of 2014, I can say many options were explored. I was the chairman of the elder board. We did it similar to how we do here. We had elders that served that weren't ordained. There was 2 ordained brothers and 3 of us laymen. And so I was tasked to help with Elvin Souder. I don't know how many of you know him, but he and I were to go find options. And so one of the things we said, well, can we build on to this building? So we met with Ames Construction and had many meetings with them. I don't know if you know this, but the Welsh Mountain Home is actually owned by Landis Homes, or somehow they're involved, so they had to be in the conversation. So we had meetings with the Welsh Mountain Home people and Landis Homes. And I'll say after many meetings, it came very clear that building on that property was a dead end. I will say during this time, the Lancaster Conference was in an upheaval with MCUSA. And there was hope, I think, within the Martindale district and at least at Mountain Spring from the pastors there, that some sort of new group may form and the Martindale district would actually move away from the Lancaster Conference. And with that conversation, I would say within the Mountain Spring congregation, there's kind of a growing uneasiness too of why we're still a part of Lancaster Conference. But I'll say that was not the main motivation for why the conversation started. It was about limited space. But as time went on, the affiliation discussion became more front and center as time went on. So in December of 2014, the leadership team at Mountain Spring presented 3 options to the congregation. One was to stay like we are, which was remain Lancaster Conference, and see what comes of the conference and how the district interacts with that. But that did nothing to solve our limited seating issue, which we had currently. Plant a new church not affiliated with Lancaster Conference, but it was clear that the church plant needed to be done independent of any of the Mountain Spring pastors or the Martindale district bishops. And the third option was consider a whole new church affiliation change. But after some time, it was in a leadership team meeting, and I remember this meeting like it was yesterday because I remember sitting there, and we just went through a Sunday where it was so full. We would literally sit people, and then we'd bring in chairs and sit more people, and then bring in more chairs and sit more people, where the aisle down the middle, I don't know if you remember, you had to literally walk sideways to get out. I think it prohibited people from using the restroom as much. And to excuse people, we would stand up and the ushers would take the chairs out of the middle and then we would be able to leave. But I remember in a leadership team meeting where the bishop was actually involved at this point to help us because of the affiliation discussion. And he said, we are going to take this discussion, and I think the exact words were, we're going to take this discussion off the table. And I didn't know what that meant because I'm like, how does that solve our seating issue? And I should maybe go back to clarify what he meant by that. But what I heard is we're going to just let that off the table for now. We're not going to discuss that. And I remember driving home from that meeting kind of like with this overwhelming sense of responsibility that we didn't provide a solution to the congregation. I knew God was up to something, but I didn't know what. Neither of the 2 pastors were interested in leading a new group. One in particular, James Bowman, he's still there today, felt very called to the home and providing a place of worship for the residents, which is very admirable, very honorable. So in no way was I was not frustrated with them in any way. They felt called there. They wanted to stay there. Relationships were healthy. So it made a lot of sense. It was in August of 2015 that I came back. I came home and I talked to Cindy. I said, Cindy, something has to be done. Like, we can't just not do something. Nothing. We can't do nothing. And so I talked with Cindy. We prayed together, and I said, Cindy, is God calling me to lead something? I don't know what that is. So I went back to the leadership team and I said, I would be willing to lead a new group if the following things were met. And one of these were 3 different things. One was that the Mountain Spring leadership team would give unanimous approval to the idea of me leading a group. If the Martindale district bishops would give unanimous approval, and as well as the congregation would give its blessing to this process. There was a part of me that was really, I will say, insecure, because I'll tell you a secret, but I made a resolution when I said that you know what, I'm going to make myself ineligible for pastor, because the last thing I wanted to do was to make it look like I wanted to become the next pastor. And God had to change me dramatically in that after that did not come to be. But anyways, there were 5 men on the Mountain Spring leadership team at this point, including myself, and 4 of them said we were going to stay with Mountain Spring. And so I remember going home from that meeting and saying, okay, God, maybe it's me and Cindy are going to be leading a church, and maybe it's just the four. I think we had 2 children at that time, 3 children. It was September 16, 2015, at a congregational meeting, which was chaired by the Bishop of Mountain Spring. And it was stated in those meeting minutes, we have had 14 meetings up to this point about these issues, and we have one final thing we want you to consider. And that is if you would bless this idea of a new group starting off of the Mountain Spring congregation. Because of the hesitancy to be a part of Lancaster Conference in the first place, it was made clear very early on that this would not be another Lancaster Conference church. Didn't know what it was going to be, but it was stated that this new group would decide affiliation. I must say, the bishop at that time, which was, I think, in transition, Darrell Weaver, just became bishop, and he facilitated the process of us and that new group forming, I say, with incredible tact and character. It could have become a little divisive, but it didn't. He facilitated the meetings. I remember they invited different men from different affiliations to come and talk about maybe where this new group would land. And then it was left up to the congregation to decide, do you want to go with this new group? We don't know what it's going to be affiliated. We just know it's not going to be Lancaster Conference. Or do you want to stay with Mountain Spring? I don't quite remember, but I think there was a sign-up sheet or something you had to put your name down to. I think we gave it to the bishop. I don't remember. I know you were encouraged not to talk to other people, but to make it a matter of prayer of what you're going to do, not just where your friends are going to go. So is God really calling you to be a part of this new group, or should you stay with Mountain Spring? Out of that, there was 36 adults, totaling about 70 to 75 people with their children, that said they would want to be part of a new group. And this new group would decide affiliation later. Then on October 10th, 2015, was the first meeting of this new group. So the group was identified, who were these people, and we met on Diller Avenue, which was our old church building. The way that came to be is Ashley Miller. He worked at Gaiman's Accounting, which just bought that building, and in my last elder board meeting at Mountain Spring, he said, well, they just moved into this building, and there's plenty of space, Charles. Maybe that would be a place where you guys could have services. And I think someone else also mentioned they talked to Ashley. I don't know if it was you, Rodney, or not. I kind of think it was. And so I called the owner of that building. I remember walking through, and it felt like a godsend, because we were praying for a building. We had checked at the New Holland Fire Hall. I actually drove into this property, and it was for sale. There's a for sale sign out. And after I drove in, I'm like, okay, I should have taken a picture, because it was really dilapidated. And I walked over to Hostetta Realty, which is right across the street, and I asked them, I said, what are you asking for that place? I didn't want to know, because I knew, number one, it looked like too big of a project, and it's probably going to be more money than we could afford anyways. And he said, unfortunately, it is going under contract tomorrow. I said, okay, that's our answer. So this place is not for us. I'll get back to that maybe a little bit later. Then in November of 2015, the group that left Mountain Spring, we discussed church names. I don't know if this is interesting to you, but this is some of the names we came up with. Christ's Way Church, City of Hope, Fruit of the Spirit Fellowship, Open Door Fellowship, Redeemed Mennonite Fellowship, Shining Light Fellowship, Water of Life, Oasis, Anchor of Hope, Living Way, Living Faith, Light of Life, Heritage, Life and Truth, and Living Chapel. The first Sunday morning of Oasis was November 8th, 2015. And the service was decided that Charles would lead about 20 minutes of worship. And Keith Lehman agreed to have a children's lesson where he would have all the children come front. There was no Sunday school per se. And then Richard Newswanger had our first sermon, and we had a fellowship meal afterwards. So that was the beginning of Oasis. So you say, one of the things Dan asked me to say, why in New Holland? So after this new group formed and we knew who was going to be a part of this new group, we looked at where people were living, and we had people living 35 minutes south of here and some of us living 30 minutes north of here. So New Holland, kind of by default of location and centralization, became a natural spot for us to hold services somewhere in New Holland. So you may wonder how we got to this building. So different times in our elder board meetings, well, let me back up. So we signed a 3-year lease with Diller Avenue, the building there in Diller. And at the 2-year mark, we went back to the owner and we said, can we sign another 3-year lease? And he said no. He said, well, I want to go year to year. I want opportunity. I want to have the opportunity if something else came up that I could rent this space out for. Well, that felt a little unsettling. So that put us on a quest to find something a little more secure. And so we visited, I shouldn't say we visited, we drove around these streets for the different times and looked at buildings, and we asked different buildings that weren't even for sale if they're available. And Jason did IT work for JM Lap, and so Jason's like, well, I wonder what Matt Lapp is going to do with this old building. And we actually drove in here one time, I think after an elder board meeting, because we didn't know what he's even doing with it. And I will tell you, it was a sorry sight. There was dumpsters out here, and there was maybe a third of the concrete was in here. It was dark and dingy, and I think they hauled 60 rollback loads of trash out of this building. Anyway, it did not look like a church at all, and I did not have the vision to see it as such. And I just thought, Jason, this is not an option. Like, it's narrow. They hadn't built. I don't think this piece was built on quite. I forget how it was, but it was very narrow. Do you put your congregate? Do you put the seating this way, or how do you make it work? And it just didn't seem feasible. I was actually praying that God would give us another congregation or another church in town, but that did not come to be. So finally, we became desperate, and so Jason talked to Matt, kind of in passing, and he said, yeah, he would be very open to a congregation moving in here. And so we met with him, and we talked about what that could look like, and all that to say is God gave us this space, and it's a beautiful space. And I think this is where God really wants us to be. I'm going to just briefly share about the vision of OMF and how we started. I just briefly looked at some of our early meeting minutes, and we wanted to answer the question, why does Oasis exist? And these are the things we said. We want to be welcoming, engaged, authentic disciples of Christ, committed to seeing the kingdom of God lived out today. We want to be... So these were different men. I think we just went around the table and we talked about this. So you're going to hear some repeat because it was different men saying things. Intentional disciples, radically changed, bringing hope and meaning to all around us. We want to be devoted, authentic, genuine, engaged, have diverse backgrounds, friendly. We want to be welcoming, committed, transparent. We want to be people that are connected through intentional discipleship, that no question is off limits or offensive. We want to be a body of believers actively living out the gospel rather than pursuing a life of ease. We want to be a church who honors God, obeys His commandments, teaches His word, loves those around Him, provides a safe and inviting environment for those seeking truth and something beyond what the society has to offer. We want a spiritual friendship, which gives spiritual direction. So those were some of the early vision that we set out for as we started the church. If you have any questions or anything I left unclear, feel free to ask. But Dan, I'll turn it over to you for now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Don and Charles. I realized after I sat down that I had said that we'd have a little time for questions and answers after each speaker, and well, it didn't happen, but let's say we have a little time now. I was always planning on that. So does anybody have a question that you would like to ask? It could refer to something I talked about, or you're curious about what I covered, or what Don talked about, or what Charles talked about.
I forgot to mention the white newsletters back there are available to be picked up.
Oh, yeah. But we do have a little display at the back. Some of that is from things that Don brought. And there are newsletters from the New Holland Area Historical Society you're welcome to take with you. There's some items that back there that were used in the mill, whether it was silk or synthetics like rayon and orlan. You're welcome to handle some of those. They're not fragile, I don't believe. There's different things. I brought some things along that kind of reflect on the agricultural heritage of this community and the spiritual heritage as well. Some books and things that you can look at there. You're welcome to do that afterwards. Any questions at all? Anybody have one?
I'm wondering, so when that Anabaptist moved from Bern to Platten, was there already an established community in Platten or not?
When they moved from Bern to the Platte. Yeah, no. They were forbidden by law from making efforts to convert the Palatinate. The ruler of the Palatinate at that point was German Reformed. That was the state church. The understanding was that all of the people in his land would be part of that church. They were baptized as infants into it. There was not an existing Anabaptist community in that area. So that they did sort of start that from scratch, if you will. I don't know that it would not be completely fair to say that there was never any people coming in to the Anabaptist circles, but it was pretty uncommon.
I was thinking my people are from the Platten region. Zimmerman. Where do they come from? Where did they originally come from? Where did they evangelize?
Yeah, my father is here tonight. My parents, mother and father here. And, he knows a lot about history and also traveled to Switzerland, so we have to talk to him afterward. Yeah, the Zimmerman name that you and I share all would be from Bern, I believe. Interestingly enough, I think my father told me that the Yoder name comes from that same village and that we pretty much line up DNA. And that was mind-blowing to me because I didn't think I had any connection to Amish people, but apparently I do, maybe, way back. Yoder and Zimmerman are different kinds of names too. But Don, you want to talk?
Yeah. I could add something too that I was going to talk about. The naming of the town New Holland, M.G. Weaver, Mennonite minister who wrote the history of New Holland for the first 200 years, is certain that it came because of the hospitality that the Dutch showed the pilgrims, if you will, as they were moving towards Rotterdam. And there wasn't a Travelocity.com back then, in case you wondered. And so you had to come there and then hope for passage. You might stay for months. And evidently, the Dutch people took such good care of our ancestors there that when they came here, it was just natural to name it New Holland. I'm going to go from memory, but I think there's 7 or 8 New Hollands I found, including one in Jamaica and one in another country. But I think there's 5 or 6 New Hollands in the United States. So you can do that by checking your weather. If you go in weather and just put in the name New Holland, you're going to get the list of them. So that's how New Holland was named. And I think it's kind of a nice thing to remember that it was actually from hospitality.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the community, I think, it had other names as before. It kind of was good.
There was one that's less kind. It was Suey Swamp, which is sow swamp or pig swamp. And it's talked about a lot with humor, but it probably was in the very earliest days when transportation out through this wooded area, somebody came and said, just keep going till you come to the pig swamp, then you're there. And I think it was that innocuous or that simple or that not having meaning other than there was a pig swamp there. And we think it was on that side, somewhere around Nult's Pond. It could have been in the Ringwald Plantation, which is right across the street from the laundromat, just on Route 23 East. There's a nice big brick building up there. That was the Ringwald Tavern. and the Ringwald Farm was behind that. There's a spring in there that furnished the water for the very early settlers. They carried it up into Main Street because there were no wells. And if you look at that, that's the lowest spot. And so we kind of think that Suey Swamp might have been down there.
Yeah, great, thanks. Anyone else?
Curious when we went back to having bishops, when the original or the early vision was it's too much like the Catholic Church to have a bishop.
The Anabaptist understanding of church leadership, I think, always probably in looking to the New Testament would have had somebody in some sort of leadership. And the German term that they preferred for that was, they actually used different terms, I should say. The one that kind of stuck was full Adina, which kind of means a full or confirmed minister. Dina kind of means minister. That's really all it means. But a person like that was called to exercise some level of authority, to preside over communion, to baptize people when they confession of faith, to sort of provide some sort of leadership for other ministers and deacons as well. In a lot of ways, to me, that idea seems pretty far into the Catholic idea of people who are the heirs of the apostles and the lords of the church kind of approach. One old order man with whom I worked for years at Good Store, in describing some sort of problem in one of the horse and buggy congregations, said, yeah, there's a deacon there who's just trying to impeach the bishop. I mean, the bishop doesn't always have the final say. The deacons have a role as well in church administration and discipline issues, and all that to say, in this country, eventually the term in German, Bischof, was adopted in the latter part of the 1800s, when I think that kind of Catholic background was pretty far receded from the minds of people, and they just said, well, you read it in Luther's translation, it says bishop, Bischof. Does that help a little, maybe? Yeah. Any other questions? Susan?
I have a question for Don.
Don, okay.
Not sure. So you mentioned that it used to be called like a knitting mill, but then they had silk parachutes, which I'm guessing were wool, but did they?
I don't know. The knitting mill, the Storb Snader knitting mill, I think they did have looms. They started with, I think, 58 looms. So loom would mean making cloth of some kind, but I am not an authority enough to know what that might have been. And yes, that's a puzzle. I think the war effort was when I think you see the great big looms. And by the way, I think some of the thread back here, we were told by somebody, that's on it's on the shuttles, I think, and maybe on some of the bobbins. They think maybe it was coffin liner material, because if you think of coffin liners, if you look at the colors back there, it feels kind of like coffin liners. So they made all kinds of cloth. This doesn't answer your question necessarily, but I don't know what knitting, how that went to making parachute cloths. I mean, I think it was just a typical transition, and I could imagine job things. Somebody came to them, could you make this, you know? And so we don't have a lot of history about exactly what they were making. There are people in town still that worked here, although not hardly any anymore. The one person that was very knowledgeable, I think, has passed away. There used to be an overhead. Does anybody remember the overhead between the old buildings? Okay, there's somebody in here old enough to, well, you don't look that old, but you remember it. A story that goes with this thing, as the transition's going on, they did have a union contest at one point, and this lady who was helping inform us was an assistant to whichever Ix was running the show at that point. And her job was to go and come over here and just walk around on the floor to hear what people were saying, and then go back and report to the Ix, you know, I think it's going our way, or I think it's not going our way. That's off of your question. except to say this was a big organization, and I think they probably made different kinds of cloth at different, yeah.
There's the overpass.
Oh, that's,
When it came down, no, Roland, did you remember it? You remember it.
I don't,
It's in his
it's in our
lifetime.
lifetime easily. I mean, it was, I would say in the past 25 years or 20 years.
I feel like I remember it, but I'm like, maybe I'm remembering another spot.
Because there is one on Custer Ave that's still there.
Maybe that's what I
I don't know.
No, this was pretty imposing. I mean, you came down Brimmer. I mean, that was what you saw as you walked down Brimmer.
Yeah.
So,
Do you remember it? Do my parents remember it being there? My parents are not as, they're not as young as they once were, but they're not super old either, you know.
that's a disease that's going around.
What I am confident of is, and this would make a lot better, easier to do, and it's light, so maybe on Sunday of next week if you're here, you walk around the end there is clearly an area on the wall where the bricks are different, and it is just about, I'm convinced that was bricked up later when they took the overpass down. This building is all siding, so you can't see anything on the exterior. But the brickwork is clearly a different color, and it's the shape of an entryway. So I think that's where it came in.
Yeah, the other thing that we heard about, as a historical society, we don't have any dog in this hunt, so to speak, but it was a horrible property. I mean, everything that's said about it was true. It just was a horrible property. There was drugs being dealt in here. There were fires, little fires. I'm almost surprised that it didn't burn down. There were barrels of chemicals around. I mean, what you see here is almost a miracle from what it was. And so when my friend Bob Eby and his partner Chad Hurst were going to get it demolished, that looked like the right solution. And I just can't quite believe what the Laps have done with it. So.
Maybe you said this in passing. What was this last used commercially?
I'd have to do a little research, and I don't want to take that amount of time, but it went through, there was a company called Mirobles, does anybody remember that name? Mirolbes, I think it was, that they had it for a while, and then Skip's Cutting, I think was the last one, always connected to clothing. Skip's Cutting, I think, was cutting things out of patterns and with patterns, and then it'd be shipped to New York to the garment district to be sewed into clothing. And so Skip's Cutting was, I think, the last bankruptcy, and the last bankruptcy was owned by a Chinese company, had the money invested in it, and they had, Chad and Bob had so much trouble. He told me that every time the Chinese bank would ask for paperwork, they'd get it to them overnight. But when then the Chinese would be 6 months till they'd get back to them again. So, and it was all over the bankruptcy, which I think was the Skip's Cutting era. I'm not being derogatory towards Skip's Cutting. I don't know any of the details, but I'm guessing it's 30 years ago. The older I get, the faster time goes, and then I really can't answer your question because I don't have any markers. But it was sitting here empty for 20 years for sure, I think. So, and we actually did some business with Skip's Cutting. So I was in business. Well, I retired 20 years ago, so you know this is well beyond 20. It's a miracle what you're sitting in here.
Okay. I think what I'm going to do at this point is ask Austin to lead us in sort of another hymn to close our meeting. I and perhaps Don will be available at the back. You'll have more specific questions. You can look at some of the things too and take your time as you need to. So, Austin, I'll let you lead us in a kind of a closing hymn, and we'll use that as our dismissal then.
"160. Hymns of the Church, 160. Let's stand for this song, and then we'll be dismissed after this song. Let's sing verses 1, 3, and 5. 1, 3, and 5.